Introduction to Hardship. The sun rose over the small, crowded neighborhood where Aisha lived, casting golden light over the cracked walls of her tiny one-room house. The sound of vendors shouting in the streets, children crying, and the distant honking of cars blended into the chaotic rhythm of her mornings. But for Aisha, this was just another day, another battle against poverty, hunger, and rejection. Born into a poor family, Aisha had known nothing but struggle since childhood. Her father, a daily wage laborer, had passed away when she was just 10 years old, leaving her mother to fend for the family. With no stable income, they relied on whatever work her mother could find, washing clothes, cleaning houses, or selling vegetables in the local market. The little they earned was never enough, and hunger was a constant companion. Despite these hardships, Aisha was determined to study. She knew education was the only way out of the cycle of poverty, but affording school fees, books, and uniforms was an impossible dream. She would often borrow books from neighbors or sneak into classrooms, hoping to listen from outside. Teachers admired her passion, but could do little to help. At home, life was no easier. Their house was nothing more than a single cramped room with a leaking roof, thin walls, and a small stove in the corner, where her mother cooked whatever little food they had. In the winter, the cold seeped in through the broken windows, and in the summer, the heat turned their tiny home into an unbearable oven. Aisha took on small jobs to support her family. She stitched clothes, cleaned houses, and sometimes even worked at a tea stall, serving customers who barely noticed her existence. Some days, she earned just enough to buy a small packet of rice. Other days, they slept hungry. The people around her never made life easier. Relatives looked down on them, neighbors whispered about their misfortunes, and society treated them as if poverty was a disease. She often heard cruel remarks: "Poor girls like you are only meant to suffer," or "Who will ever marry a girl with nothing?" These words stung, but she never let them break her spirit. Her mother, despite her own suffering, always reminded her, "Hardship is not the end of your story, Aisha. It is just the beginning." Those words became her strength. Yet no matter how strong she tried to be, there were nights when Aisha felt crushed under the weight of her struggles. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if her life would ever change. The world seemed cruel and unfair, constantly testing her limits. But deep inside, she refused to give up. She had a fire in her heart, a dream that poverty and rejection could never extinguish. One day, she promised herself, she would break free from this life, not just for herself, but for her mother, for all the girls like her who had been told they were nothing. This was just the beginning of her journey. Dreams and aspirations. Despite the heavy burden of poverty, Aisha never allowed her circumstances to kill her dreams. Every night, after finishing her chores and helping her mother, she would sit by the dim light of a flickering candle, flipping through old, borrowed books. The words on the pages weren't just lessons, they were windows into a world she longed to be a part of. A world where she wasn't just a poor girl struggling to survive, but someone who mattered, someone who had a future. Her biggest dream was to complete her education and build a life where she no longer had to beg for opportunities. She imagined herself in a college classroom, sitting among students who had never known hunger, poverty, or rejection. She dreamed of walking into an office one day, dressed in confidence, not rags, earning enough to give her mother the life she deserved. But dreaming alone wasn't enough. Aisha knew that if she wanted to escape this life, she had to work harder than anyone else. She took every small job she could find, washing clothes, sewing buttons, and running errands for shopkeepers, saving every coin she earned. It wasn't much, but it was her way of fighting back against the fate the world had written for her. When others her age spent evenings gossiping or playing, Aisha spent hers studying. She had no proper notebooks, so she wrote on scraps of paper or memorized entire lessons because she had no books of her own. Whenever she passed by a school, she would stop and watch the students, wishing she could trade places with them. But instead of letting envy consume her, she let it fuel her determination. One day, she confided in her mother, "I don't want to spend my life like this. I want to study. I want to do something great." Her mother, exhausted from a long day of labor, looked at her with tired but hopeful eyes and said, "Then do it, Aisha. Don't let this world tell you that you can't." Her words became Aisha's motivation. Every morning she woke up with a purpose. She found ways to learn, listening to radio programs, sneaking into public libraries when no one was watching, and even standing outside classrooms where teachers left the windows open. But her journey wasn't easy. Society reminded her at every step that girls like her had no right to dream. Relatives mocked her ambitions, telling her she should accept her fate and marry young. Shopkeepers refused to let her touch books because they assumed she couldn't afford them. Yet she refused to let their words define her. Aisha's dreams weren't just fantasies, they were her escape, her weapon, her way out. And no matter how hard life tried to push her down, she would keep fighting for them. Because deep inside she knew, one day, she would turn her dreams into reality. Love and rejection. For the first time in her life, Aisha felt something that made her forget all the pain, the struggles, and the hunger. Love. It came unexpectedly, like a soft breeze on a scorching day, in the form of someone who made her believe she was more than just a poor girl trying to survive. His name was Samir. Samir was everything Aisha was not: wealthy, educated, and from a respected family. He had the privilege of a life she could only dream of. Yet he never looked down on her like others did. He spoke to her with kindness, listened to her dreams, and even encouraged her to keep studying. He made her feel seen, valued, and, for the first time, worthy of love. Their conversations were innocent at first, small moments stolen in the marketplace, casual greetings when they crossed paths. But as time passed, those moments became the brightest part of Aisha's life. She knew the world would never approve of them, but in his presence, she allowed herself to dream beyond survival. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Samir found Aisha sitting near the old bridge, lost in thought. He sat beside her, and after a long silence, he finally spoke the words she had secretly longed to hear. "I like you, Aisha," he admitted. "I don't care about what people think. I just know that when I'm with you, I feel at peace." Her heart swelled with emotions she had never known before: hope, happiness, and a quiet longing for something beautiful. But deep inside, a small voice warned her, this love will never be accepted. And she was right. When Samir's family found out about their growing closeness, everything changed. They did not see Aisha as a young woman full of dreams and determination. They saw only her poverty, her broken home, and her struggle for survival. To them, she was not worthy of their son. "You are not one of us," his mother told her coldly when she confronted Aisha in the marketplace. "A girl like you should know her place." Soon after, Samir began to distance himself. He stopped meeting her, stopped looking at her the way he used to. When she finally gathered the courage to ask him why, his answer shattered her. "My family will never accept this," he whispered, guilt in his eyes. "I can't go against them." Aisha felt her heart crack in a way she had never imagined. She had faced hunger, loneliness, and rejection before, but this pain was different. It was the pain of knowing that no matter how much she tried, she would always be defined by her poverty. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not break. Not for him, not for a world that had always seen her as less. That night, as she lay awake, she made a silent promise to herself. If love was not meant for girls like her, then so be it. She would turn her pain into strength. She would prove that she was more than just a poor girl. And one day, the world that had rejected her would have no choice but to see her worth. Betrayal and setbacks. After Samir walked away, Aisha thought she had already felt the worst kind of pain, but life had more trials waiting for her. The heartbreak she suffered was only the beginning of an even deeper wound: betrayal. She had always believed that no matter how cruel the world was, at least she had her mother and a few close friends by her side. But as she tried to move forward, she began to notice the subtle changes. Neighbors whispered louder when she walked past. Relatives, who once tolerated her presence, now avoided her completely. Even the women who used to give her small sewing jobs no longer answered when she knocked on their doors. At first, she didn't understand why. Then she heard the rumors. She thought she could trap a rich boy. Girls like her should know their limits. She brings shame to her own mother. The same people who had watched her struggle every day, who had seen her fight against the odds, now turned against her. They did not see her heartbreak. They only saw a poor girl who had dared to dream beyond her status. Even her friends, the few she had, began to drift away. Some avoided her out of fear of being judged. Others simply didn't want to be associated with someone society had marked as disgraced. But the biggest betrayal came from someone she had never expected, her own mother. One evening, after another day of rejection, Aisha returned home to find her mother sitting silently, her face tired, her eyes filled with something Aisha couldn't quite understand. "You have to stop this," her mother finally said, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "Stop what?" Aisha asked, confused. "Stop chasing dreams that will never be yours. Stop making our lives harder." Aisha's heart clenched. "Mama, I just want a better life. I want to study, to work, to—" "To what?" her mother interrupted, her voice breaking. "To keep fighting a world that will never accept you? Look around you, Aisha. No one stands with you, not your friends, not our family. And now, because of you, I can't even find work." Tears welled up in Aisha's eyes. She wanted to scream, to tell her mother that she was fighting for both of them, that she wasn't the enemy, that she was trying to change their lives, not ruin them. But what hurt the most was knowing her mother wasn't wrong. She had lost everything, her love, her friends, and now even the support of the one person she thought would always stand by her. That night, as she sat alone in the darkness, she realized something painful but true. She had no one left. If she was going to survive in this world, she would have to do it alone. A moment of despair. The walls of Aisha's tiny home had never felt so suffocating. The silence was heavy, pressing down on her like an unbearable weight. She sat on the cold, hard floor, staring at her hands, hands that had worked tirelessly, hands that had held onto dreams, hands that had been pushed away too many times. Rejection had followed her like a shadow, creeping into every part of her life. She had lost Samir, the only person who had made her feel special. She had lost her friends, who had chosen society over loyalty. And now, even her own mother, the one person she had always believed would stand by her, had turned away. She had nothing left. Aisha clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She had fought so hard, studied in the dim candlelight, worked long hours just to buy books, endured cruel words from those who saw her as nothing. And yet, where had it led her? Nowhere. She was still the poor girl, still the outcast, still the one who wasn't enough. For the first time in her life, she felt truly defeated. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Crying wouldn't change anything. But as the weight of everything crushed down on her, she felt something break inside her. A deep, aching pain she had kept buried for too long. She stood up abruptly, stepping outside into the cold night. The streets were quiet, the world moving on as if her suffering didn't matter. She walked without direction, her mind clouded with hopelessness. She reached the old bridge, the same place where Samir had once sat beside her, where she had dared to believe in love. Now she stood there alone, staring down at the dark waters below. For a moment she wondered, what if she just let go? What if she let the waves take away the pain, the rejection, the never-ending struggle? Would the world even notice if she disappeared? But then, a voice echoed in her mind. Hardship is not the end of your story, Aisha. It is just the beginning. Her mother's words, spoken long ago, before the weight of the world had broken her, before she had given up on Aisha. And then another memory of her younger self, sitting outside a classroom, listening to a lesson she wasn't allowed to be part of, dreaming of a day when she wouldn't have to beg for knowledge. She had come too far. She couldn't let them win. Taking a deep breath, She stepped back from the edge. She wiped her tears, straightened her back, and made a silent promise to herself. If the world wanted to break her, it would have to try harder, because she wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not ever. The turning point. Aisha walked back home that night with a new fire burning inside her. The despair that had almost consumed her was now replaced with something stronger: determination. If the world refused to give her a chance, she would create her own. If people turned their backs on her, she would walk forward alone. She refused to be defined by rejection. The first thing she did was set a clear goal. She would complete her education no matter how hard it was. She had no money for school fees, but she wouldn't let that stop her. She started searching for better jobs, anything that could help her earn more. She took on extra work at the tailor's shop, stitching clothes late into the night. She cleaned more houses, took on sewing projects, and even helped at a local food stall. The exhaustion was unbearable at times, but every rupee she saved brought her closer to her goal. She also changed how she viewed herself. She stopped seeking validation from others. She no longer cared if people whispered about her in the streets. Their words no longer held power over her. One day, she gathered enough courage to approach a school principal. She told him her story, about her struggles, her dreams, and her determination to learn. The man listened quietly. Then, after a long pause, he said, "You remind me of someone I once knew, a girl who fought against the odds just like you. I will allow you to attend classes on one condition. You must work as a part-time cleaner at the school to cover your fees." Aisha's heart pounded. It wasn't the perfect solution, but it was a chance, and she would take it. Balancing school and work was not easy. She spent her mornings studying and her evenings working. There were days when exhaustion made her body ache, but she pushed through. She reminded herself why she started this journey, to prove that she was more than what the world saw her as. Slowly, things began to change. She became one of the top students in her class. Teachers noticed her dedication, and a few even helped her with books and resources. And then, something even more surprising happened. Some of the same people who once mocked her now started respecting her. They saw her resilience, her refusal to give up, and they couldn't ignore it anymore. But Aisha didn't do this for them. She did it for herself. She had found her strength, not in the approval of others, but in her own belief that she was capable of more. This was her turning point, and she was just getting started. The road to success. Aisha's life was no longer just about survival. It was about growth, about proving to herself that she was capable of more than anyone ever believed. With each passing day, she worked harder, studied longer, and pushed herself beyond her limits. Her dedication at school paid off. She became one of the top students, excelling in subjects she had once struggled with. Her teachers, seeing her determination, recommended her for a scholarship program. When she received the news that her tuition would be fully covered, she couldn't believe it. It was the first real victory in her long battle against the odds. But Aisha wasn't just focused on education. She knew she needed financial independence. Alongside her studies, she started a small sewing business. Using her skills, she began stitching clothes for local women. At first, customers were hesitant. After all, she was still just a poor girl. But her work spoke for itself. Her stitches were precise, her designs unique, and soon word spread. More people came to her, trusting her talent. The same neighbors who had once gossiped about her started respecting her. The same relatives who had dismissed her as a lost cause now looked at her with curiosity, even admiration. But Aisha didn't seek their approval. She had learned that success wasn't about proving others wrong. It was about proving herself right. One of the biggest moments in her journey came when she graduated from college. Standing on that stage, receiving her degree, she felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. She had done what everyone thought was impossible. Opportunities followed. She secured a job at a prestigious company, earning a stable income. But she didn't stop there. She used her savings to expand her tailoring business, turning it into a full-fledged boutique. She hired women who, like her, had been told they were nothing, giving them a chance to build their own futures. With time, Aisha's name became known beyond her small town. She was invited to speak at events, sharing her story of perseverance. Young girls looked up to her, seeing in her a reflection of their own struggles and their own potential. One day, as she stood outside her boutique, she saw Samir passing by. He looked at her, surprised, perhaps even regretful. But Aisha no longer needed his validation. She had built a life that no longer depended on anyone's approval. She had walked a road filled with obstacles, but she had never stopped moving forward. And now, she was exactly where she was meant to be. Recognition and revenge. Success had a strange way of changing people's perceptions. The same town that once looked down on Aisha now spoke of her with admiration. The same neighbors who had whispered cruel words about her were now eager to claim they had always believed in her potential. Her boutique had grown into a successful fashion business, and her story had inspired many. Newspapers wrote about her journey from poverty to success, and young girls saw her as a role model. She had become everything she had once dreamed of: independent, respected, and powerful in her own right. But what amused her the most was watching the regret on the faces of those who had once rejected her. One day, as she was overseeing work at her boutique, an unexpected visitor walked in: Samir. He looked different, older, weighed down by something unspoken. "You've done well for yourself," he said, offering a small smile. Aisha simply nodded, waiting. I regret the way things ended between us," he admitted, hesitating. "I was a coward. I should have stood by you." Aisha looked at him, but she felt nothing: no pain, no longing, no anger. He was just a piece of her past, someone who had once mattered but no longer had any power over her. "I'm glad you realized that," she said simply, her voice calm, controlled. "But I don't need apologies. I needed support back then, not now." Samir lowered his gaze, knowing he had lost something valuable. But it wasn't just him. Her relatives, who had once mocked her ambitions, now tried to reconnect, pretending they had always been proud of her. Some even asked for favors: loans, jobs, business partnerships. Aisha never sought revenge in the traditional sense. She didn't need to humiliate them, didn't need to throw their past words back in their faces. Her success was her revenge. The life she had built was proof that she had never needed their approval. One day, as she passed through the old marketplace, she saw her mother standing at a fruit stall. Their eyes met, and for the first time in years, her mother's gaze wasn't filled with disappointment. It was filled with pride and regret. Aisha walked up to her. "Come home with me," she said softly. Tears welled up in her mother's eyes as she nodded. Aisha had fought alone, suffered alone, and risen alone. But now she was no longer just surviving, she was thriving. And the world that had once rejected her, now it had no choice but to respect her. A test of character. Aisha had won. She had built a life that no longer depended on anyone's approval. The same people who had once mocked her now admired her. The same society that had rejected her now celebrated her success. She had every reason to turn her back on them, to let them feel the pain of rejection just as she had. But deep inside, she knew that true strength wasn't about revenge, it was about rising above. One day, she was invited to give a speech at a local women's empowerment event. As she stood before the audience, she saw familiar faces: her former friends who had abandoned her, the relatives who had once dismissed her dreams, even Samir, sitting quietly in the back. She could have used that moment to remind them of their cruelty, to make them regret every word they had spoken against her. But instead, she chose a different path. She took a deep breath and said, "For years, I was told I wasn't enough, that my dreams were too big for a girl like me, that I would never make it. But here I stand today, not because I proved them wrong, but because I proved myself right." The crowd fell silent, hanging on to her every word. Success is not about revenge, it's about growth. It's about using every rejection, every insult, every failure as fuel to build yourself into someone unstoppable. If I had spent my life trying to get back at those who hurt me, I would still be trapped in the past. Instead, I chose to move forward, and that is the real victory. Aisha looked around the room, meeting the eyes of those who had once doubted her. She saw guilt, regret, and admiration, but none of it mattered anymore. After the event, a young girl approached her, eyes filled with hope. "Your story changed something in me," the girl said. "I want to fight for my dreams too." Aisha smiled. This was the true reward, not proving people wrong, but inspiring others to believe in themselves. She had been tested, broken, and left alone. But she had risen, not with anger, but with purpose. And in the end, that was her greatest triumph. Victory and inspiration. Aisha had reached the pinnacle of success. The world now recognized her not just for her achievements, but for the strength and resilience she had shown through years of struggle. Yet, the true victory lay not in the accolades or the wealth she had accumulated, but in the choice she made every day to rise above the pain of her past. One afternoon, she stood at the edge of her boutique, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over everything she had built. People walked by, some of them nodding in recognition, others stopping to admire the boutique's elegant displays. But Aisha wasn't thinking about the success of her business. She was thinking about the journey that had brought her here. As she reflected, her thoughts turned to those who had once rejected her, her family, Samir, the people who had turned their backs on her in her darkest hours. For so long, she had carried a deep bitterness within her, a desire for vengeance that had fueled her determination to succeed. But as time passed, something shifted inside her. She realized that holding on to resentment, to the pain of the past, would only keep her tied to the hurt that had once defined her. Forgiveness wasn't for them, it was for her. It was the final step in letting go of the chains that had kept her from truly moving forward. One by one, she reached out to those who had wronged her. She invited her mother over for dinner, asking her to join her in the new home she had built, a symbol of her independence, but also a place where healing could begin. To Samir, she wrote a letter, not of bitterness, but of understanding. She thanked him for the lessons he had taught her and wished him well, even though their paths had parted long ago. As Aisha began to forgive, she realized that the true strength wasn't in how much she had fought back, but in how much she had learned to let go. She didn't need revenge. What she needed was peace, and that came only through releasing the past. Her decision to forgive and rise above her pain became the most powerful part of her story. People began to see her not just as a woman who had overcome adversity, but as a woman who had chosen to rise with grace and compassion. She became a beacon of hope to others who struggled, showing them that strength didn't come from holding on to anger or past wrongs. It came from within, from the courage to move forward, to embrace the future without being defined by the past. Her story spread far and wide, inspiring countless others to find their own strength, to overcome the hardships that life threw their way, and to forgive, not because it was easy, but because it was the key to freedom. Aisha had built a life of success and independence, but her true legacy was the way she had turned her pain into power and chosen forgiveness over vengeance. She proved that true victory wasn't about defeating others. It was about conquering the darkness within and choosing to live with a heart full of hope.